Sorry, boy, but his captain's got to teach his men what happens to those what cross him.
Captain's got to teach stuff.
Good morning from the Batcave. It is Thursday, May 21st, 2021, and I know I said I was going to do a video about Christ fulfilling all the covenants, and I dropped those slides on my Patreon. I will get to that maybe tomorrow, maybe this weekend, or maybe next week. I haven't decided. But what I want to do is actually, while this is all fresh in my mind, I want to do another Serpent by the Way update because I have made some amazing discoveries in basically the evolution of all these mystery religions that pop out, starting with Brahmanism and leading into Buddhism, and then in the West, it's going to be Thales, Solon, and Pythagoras, leading into Plato. And then in China, it's going to start out with Confucius and leading into Taoism. There's other ones there, but they're all going to kind of through a common phase where their political disruption is opening up the door for all these different philosophers to come in with a what they consider a more optimized version of what right and wrong is, as something they hope to propagate within the next basically emerging regional hegemon, basically whatever that main government is that takes over. So Buddhism kind of ends up winning that battle in India, or at least for a while, until Brahmanism takes over. What's the name is as Taoism gets it in China. Until the Han Chinese take over, and then it turns back to Confucianism, and then it's really Aristotle's ethical system, or his paradigm, takes over in Greece until the Roman Catholics take over and they merge it with Neoplatonism. So they're all doing the same thing, but what people don't realize is, like, all of these philosophical systems are all rooted in admitted demonic activity. Socrates had a demon, he admits it, and he's all over Plato's writings admitting that he has a demon and that he's getting this inspired stuff. The Brahmins are getting it from their false gods and from visions and meditations and stuff like this. And then Buddha claims to be psychic and going on these basically astral projection runs to meet with gods and be commissioned to do this stuff. And then Lao Tzu, who is the founder of Taoism, he doesn't talk about how he gets his information, but he's clearly speaking in the first person with the demon speaking through him that is actually pretty much admits to being the woman of wickedness of Shinar. So I'm going to get into these details and kind of summarize this, but you could literally summarize this is everything I'm going to say is this. When you hear Kathleen Kennedy say the Force is female, she's not lying, because literally the Tao, or the Way, which is what Star Wars is built on, is a feminine spirit, and that feminine spirit's called the Spirit of the Valley, but the main name for it is the Way, or the Tao, is the Force. And so when she says the Force is female, that is literal, because everything in Jedi and the whole mysticism behind the Star Wars universe is based in Taoism. And if you read it, and I'm gonna show you this quote because it's going in my book, she admits to having many forms throughout the earth that she's going to eventually unify into one. And I'm going to show you how Shinar is just, it's the Xi dynasty of China. So the Xi dynasty of China, they can't find archaeologically in China, which is why they think it's mythological. But I'm going to show you how it's actually, it's because it's Shinar in Mesopotamia. And the Chinese, because they don't get writing for almost 1,000 years later, when they write this stuff down, they're going to confuse the two rivers of Mesopotamia with the two main rivers of China and assume that it's still talking about the land of China, when in fact it's after the Tower of Babel. It's about 100 years after the Tower of Babel when the written script first gets to them. And by the time they write this stuff down, and it's in Confucius's Book of Documents, there's clear evidence that they're talking about Mesopotamia and not China. But again, the Chinese didn't know that, because by this time they've forgotten all about Mesopotamia, even though they're talking about how their kingdom started in the center of the earth. And so China to this day thinks China is the center of the earth because its origin point was Shinar in Mesopotamia, which is actually the center of the earth. Okay, so for starters, I'm just going to kind of walk you guys through the Chinese history of how this stuff gets to the way it is, and then from there, we're going to I'm going to take you into approximately up to about the 2nd century BC, which is when the Han Dynasty takes over, and then that is the dynasty that is going to rule until the time Christ comes. And that dynasty ends up being Confucian, but the Qin Dynasty, which is the one who reunified China after the Zhou Dynasty falls apart, they're actually Taoist, and they're trying to institute like a Taoist brand of legalism. But where you find Taoism ultimately today is in Tai Chi. It's in the Tai Chi martial arts system. So if you're hearing a lot of, especially on your commercial feeds and stuff like that, a lot of people trying to get you into Tai Chi. I'm going to talk about this a little bit later. I met a Tai Chi, I don't know if he was a master or he was just a martial artist of Tai Chi. He prophesied to me this overturning of America by basically Eastern mysticism that is going to occur in the last days. I believe what he was saying was demonic, but also somewhat true, because their belief system corresponds to America becoming parts of the kings of the East and fighting against the Antichrist in the last days. And if you remember, one of the first things the Antichrist does when he takes over is he destroys the harlot, which is, says the 10 kings will hate the harlot and they're going to just burn her with fire. But the harlot is basically, think about the beast and the harlot like this. The harlot is trying to synthesize all the world's religions into one and create this pseudo equality and balance among all the world's cultures and all the world's religions. The Antichrist is going to say, no, all that worship goes to me and me alone, and he's going to make it basically a revised Roman Empire with him as the Caesar God King, basically. And that's when the kings of the East are going to rebel against that, and they're going to lead towards the Battle of Armageddon, which they're going to rely on something similar as a means to kind of unify their different countries who are going to be going against the Antichrist with them. And the way that is going to work itself out is basically there being kind of a separate but equal one world religion, if you will. So where the harlot was blending all the world's religions together towards the worship of the Antichrist, and then the Antichrist institutes the mark of the beast, and it's just like you're either united to me in this, technocratic transhuman way, like the church is united to Christ, or I'm going to kill you. They're going to have kind of like a separate but equal nationalistic religious sphere that is going to be comparable to the American federal system and then the South states' rights system in the American Civil War. So the whole American experiment was the prototype for what they were going to do on the world stage. And if you know the American system, it was originally a bunch of Christian denominations that they're doing it with. On the world stage, they're going to do it with a bunch of nationalist religious states. So don't be surprised if you see something like a Confucian revival in China or a Taoist revival in China or something like that. Or maybe it's just atheistic, but you'll see probably orthodoxy in what's left of Russia after World War III. You're going to see an Islamic fundamentalist bloc that's probably going to extend from Persia to Iran. You're going to see Hindu nationalism in India. You're probably going to see Buddhist nationalism from Nepal into Southeast Asia. And then you'll probably see a false Christian nationalism in America. And all of these are going to bind together under the belief that from the American post-millennial sphere, that this guy's just another Hitler and we need to unify the allies to destroy him, basically. And I have talked to Presbyterians who have said that's exactly what they'll do if they see something. When I describe exactly what the Antichrist does in the Bible, they said if they see that, they think he's another Hitler and just try to kill with him. Of course, we united with communists and Muslims and whoever we could against Hitler and against the Soviet Union, so they're going to do the same thing again, okay? So to start out with all this, we're going to get into, let's see, Book of Documents. So the Book of Documents was written by Confucius, but it represents the Chinese origin history. It really is a history and not a mythology. It doesn't have a creation myth. It starts with the earliest known history of the Chinese, and it clearly goes back to Shinar, okay? So if you if you go back to the territory, here's your proof that this is Shinar and Mesopotamia and not Shinar. So if you look at this, it talks about how this guy named Shun, Emperor Shun, which is Puzur Suen. You're going to see him it's Puzur Shun or Puzur Suen, which means protected by sign in Mesopotamia. That's who this is. And so I've searched the Rig Veda, and now I've searched the Chinese Book of Documents, and I can line this up. This guy who is basically the king, and this all, like, the cool thing is, as I've been reading this and discovering this, it was very clear that what Nimrod overthrows is an emperor that passed down from Sin to a son of Cush, who was married into him, and so he's going to take the Shun last name, and then his title becomes Puzur Shun, protected by sign in Mesopotamia. Okay, when the Rig Veda describes the coming of the Asavan twins, which I totally believe are Shem and Japheth, to overthrow this kingdom, it talks about how this guy who was a son of Krishna, which is the Aryan name for Cush, it means the black one, had basically his son kidnapped, which is something that kings would do. They would kidnap your son. This is done to Josiah's son when Necho of Egypt takes over. They kidnap their son to make sure that they'll play ball, okay, and they keep him as like a palace guest, but they're basically a hostage, okay. So this lines up exactly, because what we have is this kingdom of this Yu Shun or Puzur Shun. It doesn't really say what happens to it afterwards. It just jumps right to the justification for the Shang overthrow of the Ji in China after that. So it doesn't talk about Nimrod or any of this stuff. But if you go to the Rig Veda, it talks about this guy. First of all, this guy's name who's called Yu Shun, he's the son of Kushu, okay, which is Cush, okay? The U at the end is what a Sinite or Sumerian would put at the end of a name, which would mean of Kushu, son of Kushu he's literally, it would just say son Kushu, which means son of Cush. That's it. So in the Rig Veda, it's the son of Krishna. And his son gets kidnapped, and he goes to the Asavan twins to try to get relief from this tyrant. So you can put these different histories together and go, oh, this is what happens when Sargon of Akkad takes over the empire of Mesopotamia after Noah dies. And what happens is you have Shem judging from Salem, and you have Japheth judging from Ararat. And so it talks about this guy, Yu Shun, when he finds this, when he gets handed the emperorship, he scopes out the territory and he maps it out into districts, okay? And so this is how the Chinese system is in terms of how their different regions are governed. And if you know what this is based on, this is the old Sumerian NC system. So you would have the NCs and then the Enki, okay? So the Enki basically means priest of the earth, or chief of the earth, if you will. They're more like a village shaman or priest or chief, who's both a priest and like a mayor. And then the Enki is the one for the world. And so that would be the high priest, okay? Well, Noah sets up that person as Shem, who is Melchizedek, which is why his name means Lord of Righteousness, or King of Peace, okay? The point of this person is to act as a high judiciary in case there's a conflict between city-states that exceeds beyond them being able to mitigate that at the local level. And so all you had was city-states, which, imagine it being like a state in the United States, but the capital is the main city there. Most of the trade flows through there, and then there is where you would have any issues judiciated, basically, if there's any conflicts or anything like that. Well, the Chinese would break that down to the village level too and say, okay, you have a village prefect, and it's basically an extension of that same system, but they just move it forward to have like a local judge, a state judge, and then a world judge. And that becomes the Chinese emperor, but it's completely based in the whole NC system. So you see this same system move to India with the Sumerians, and it becomes Agni and the Angarasis. Agni is based on Enki, okay? And the Angarasis just literally means those of the sons of Enki. That's what it basically means, okay? And so you can tell they're propagating that Sumerian system to India, but then eventually gets taken over by the Brahmin system. And then it goes to China, and it stays pretty pure. So like the Chinese religion and government is pretty much the exact government that existed in China, but it does it's usurped a couple times, but its form is almost exactly the same, okay? Which is why the Chinese, basically, their main culture is based around the decree of heaven, the mandate of heaven, which is basically fate based on reading astrology, ancestor worship, which is based on revering your dead ancestors, and then this emperor king who's like the priest, or he's called the son of heaven. And then in the Shang system, above him was Shang Di, which is basically sign the divine. And then above him is Tian, which is basically heaven. So it's the Chinese version of Dayus or Uranus or Varuna in the Hindu system, which is basically the transcendent god of the heavens. Okay, so they would just call it heaven. Okay, and the law of heaven is the way of heaven, and that's what becomes Taoism. So think of the law of heaven exactly like the Hindus and Buddhists and stuff like that. Think of Dharma, which is the divine cosmic law, and then the mandate of heaven, the decree of heaven, is the fatalistically determined right to rule the people under God's authority in their view, okay? This goes all the way back to Sumer and Lagash, and these guys talk about getting the Tablets of Destiny. The Tablets of Destiny is the exact same astrologically based justification for overthrowing government that they would claim before the flood, that turns into the World War before the flood. And then after the flood, they're going to go down, and it says they find a plain in Shinar. Shinar is literally where the name China comes from. Shinar just means the land of Sin. Sin is the Canaanite. Remember, you have the two Canaanite tribes, Zemar, where Sumer comes from, and Sin, where Shinar comes from. Okay, so you have these two Canaanite tribes that move over from Canaan into Mesopotamia, which is what Moses says. It says they expand out from there. And then by the time this history starts, there's a king named Yao Shun. Okay, Yao Shun seems to be Sin. Now, I don't know what the Yao means, but this is Sin. Okay, and he's the first emperor. He's the emperor of Mesopotamia. Well, this would make sense because Ham, who's known all over the Himalayan region as Yama, that's the Canaanite pronunciation of his name is Yama. Ham is going to establish this government and then move on and establish the Indian sphere with Rama and Shiva. Okay, and so as he's leaving it behind, he's going to leave behind what seems to be Canaan and Sin and Zemar as the heads of this thing. And so by the time you're into this Chinese period, most of those guys have died, but Sin would have been in the history of people who would still live to be 400 years old. Okay, so you have Ham living to be 600 years old, and he's going to probably die after them, but he's all the way over in India. He's in Pakistan. And so you're going to have Canaan, who lives to be about 400 years, and then his son Sin, who lives to be about 400 years. So Canaan seems to die, and his name is preserved in different ways, but he's basically this Lord of Wisdom kind of guy. He's the first wizard, okay? And then it talks about how Yao Shun takes his two sons and he commits them to learning and mapping all the astrological patterns and becoming astrological priests. So this is where the astrological priesthood comes from, which is going to expand to Mesopotamia. It's going to expand to China. It becomes part of the Babylonian mysteries, and it's going to expand to Egypt from there. but it's the sons of Sin who figured this out. There's these two guys named, I think it's like Hu and Ho or something like that, but very similar, but it's two sons of Sin, okay? And then he's going to have this other guy, as he's trying to figure out who's going to rule the empire after him, a number of people get suggested to him, and he is going to settle on this guy named Shun, who people are saying, like, this guy's really wise because he's figuring out how to control the flooding of the rivers. Well, if you know what was going on, and especially gets worse around the time that Ham dies, what you have is these ice ages are melting from what God caused he says he made a great wind pass over the earth in Genesis 8:1, and it causes the floodwaters to abate. Well, what that ends up with is huge polar ice caps and a lot more snow in the mountains in various places. And so because you have a lot more snow and snowpack and glacial ice in all the mountains in the world, what you end up with is a lot of river systems that don't exist now. And so some of those river systems included a river system that flowed from the mountains in Jordan to the east of the Jordan River, down and connected with the Euphrates River, and you have the mountain system of the Hejaz, which is Western Arabia, that would flow down and connect to the Euphrates River. Those are the two river systems, it seems, or at least one of those is one of the river systems that Moses is mentioning where Eden was, and then the other one seems to flow down from the Zagros Mountains, which is where the Medes are, and that one would connect. That's the river of Cush that he talks about. So you had Cushites there after basically Sargon's government is kicked out, because remember, Shun is the son of Cush, so you have a bunch of Cushites there, okay? So Krishna or Cush, he had people up in this Mesopotamian system, and then two of his sons are going to go with Ham over to India and establish India with Rama and Shiva. And basically it looks like Brahman either means elder Ammon, which is Ham, or elder Rama, which is Rama, okay? But the Dravidian language system would put an N at the end of a lot of god names, so you'll find like Rama, Shiva, and Brahma with an N at the end, and that becomes the basis for the Brahmin priesthood, because the Aryans, Vir means hero, but to the Dravidians, Pir means elder or master, okay? So Master Rama is basically, that would make sense, because that's the oldest, underneath Ham, that's the oldest patriarch who's in charge there, so it's probably Rama. And then Ham is going to die, and he's going to become Yama, the god of the dead, the one who's in charge of eventually reincarnation, or, before that, kind of the escorting of the righteous souls to kind of their version of the Abraham's bosom, if you will. Same thing as in Egypt with, you're going to hear it with Nu and Ammon, which is Noah and Ham, okay? So when Shun gets the government, what he's going to do, it talks about him getting the heads of the 4 tribes, which we know in Shinar you're going to have the Semites, which would basically be the sons of Arphaxad, that become the Chaldeans. The Hebrews are there, but they're much lower generation, so they're actually like 3 generations down from Arphaxad, so they would be one of those people that are there among them. That's the main Semites who are supposed to get that land. And then you have the Sinites, and then you have the Zemarites, and then you have the Cushites. Those are the 4 tribes that are there. So it talks about how Shun, who is a son of Cushu, gets the 4 tribes together, and then they go and consult with the 12 patriarchs, which if you were to go to who's died from the line of Adam, it would be Adam all the way down to Cush. So basically in his old age, Shun, who seems to be Sin himself, he might have just died or he might still be alive, but the 12 patriarchs before him would have been either all the way down to Cush or all the way down to Canaan. Either way, it's 12 generations from Adam down to them. So it says they go to the tombs of the 12 patriarchs and they consult them. So if we are in Sumer, which is where they are, though, that would be basically where they know that Adam all the way down to Cush or Canaan is buried, okay? And so they go to them and they consult the dead about how to, rule and reign and blah, blah, blah. And then it talks about how he goes, it says in the 5th month, he went southward inspecting the territories. Because remember, Shinar is in Think of this like right where Babylon is, okay? That's where the territory of Babylon all through the Old Testament is called Shinar, okay? So it says in the 5th month he went southward, so he's going down into southern Iraq, and arrived at the southern mountain, and then he followed the Tay Mountain ceremony. In the 8th month he went westward, inspecting the territories and arriving at the western mountain, and then he followed the same course as before. In the 11th month he went northward, making an inspection of the territories and arriving at the northern mountain. He carried out the western ceremonies. Then he returned, and coming to the polite ancestor, he made use of a single victim. So this is coming to the polite ancestor. He made use of a single victim, and I would expect the victim to basically be an animal sacrifice back then. They weren't doing human sacrifice yet. So I'm not sure what the southern mountain is, because I know this domain seems to have included Arabia, which you would have had mountains down in the south. Okay, so if you go straight south from Mesopotamia, there's this place called Dumun, which is Qatar, and then if you keep going south, there's mountains like Oman. Okay, this doesn't work for China, because if you go to China, you go to the yellow. Let's see, the Shang Dynasty in China, which is the main geographic dynasty of China from, I hate this AI sometimes. It's the main geographic territory of the Chinese Empire pretty much until the coming of the Han in the 2nd century BC. It's this, you see the Yellow River here, and I forget what river this is, but these are the main 2 river systems. This bigger one, I believe, is the Yangtze River. So you see parts of the Yangtze River over here and the Yellow River. Those are the main 2 river systems that govern China, which is similar to Mesopotamia having the Tigris and Euphrates, okay? But when they talk about a southern mountain, if you go to the south of this territory, there's no mountains here. This is all lowland. The Himalayas are over here. This is where these rivers flow from. And so you'd have mountains all through here in the west, but you don't have mountains in the north. See, you see these rivers here, they flow down towards it. Notice it's north of their entire domain. The only rivers going into their domain are coming from the Himalayas, and they flow through, and around the Gobi Desert and down through China. But they're all coming from the west here. There's no northern mountain and there's no southern mountain. So this doesn't make sense at all. However, if you go to if you go to the Middle East map, you would have, so here is, if you can see this, here is Mesopotamia right here. This is Shinar. You have mountains to the south, so this is all mountainous down here. And they would talk about this, here's Dilmun, that's their main trade port city that would connect them to Africa and Egypt. You have mountains to the west, which is basically these mountain ranges in Jordan, and it goes all the way down to these mountains in the Hejaz. So those are the western mountains. And then you have mountains to the north. There's Turkey. This is the southern, I think it's called the Zagreb Mountains or whatever. This is where Göbekli Tepe and stuff like this is, but also the mountains of Ararat. So it's surrounded by mountain ranges in every direction. So this only makes sense, again, if you understand that there are rivers all flowing towards the Persian Gulf in every direction, because there's mountains in every direction. You don't have this in China. You have western mountains, but you don't have northern mountains and southern mountains, okay? And so when you see this, you have to remember, and there's this guy, his channel is Black Sheep something, BLKSHP, you'll find it. And he does all this work on the Hebrew tribes that used to live here. This used to be a lush land. Remember, there was mountains all around here on this edge and then down here in the south, and rivers flowed from those mountains toward the Persian Gulf. And so these lands would have been very well watered, just like Iraq was from the Tigris and the Euphrates. But then because of the prevailing winds, those snow caps are eventually going to melt. And when they melt, they never come back because the prevailing winds just keep pushing the rains away from this way. And that's why it's all desertified now, okay? Whereas these ones, they continue to flow because even though they have those same prevailing winds, they're surrounded by mountains up here in areas where it's much colder. And so they continue to get snowpack and ice flows that come from those rivers, okay? Same thing with Egypt. Egypt is largely desertified, but the main river that feeds it is going to be the Ethiopian highlands, which it's a lot higher elevation, and it's also a lot wetter down there. And so whether it's from rain or from snow, depending on where you are, that's going to continue to maintain the river system. However, if those mountaintops dry up, it never comes back. The river never comes back. You might have like a seasonal wadi where you get some rains where it's going to flow through and then it's just going to be gone for the rest of the year, but you're not going to get rivers. And we have that here in Arizona. We have large kind of like divots and diverts that are built between neighborhoods and along the highways and stuff for seasonal rains, but they don't continue to exist as rivers. All of our water comes from the Colorado River because it's, year-round snow up in the Rocky Mountains, basically. So they're describing a territory that is clearly Shinar, not China. Okay, and this is why your archaeologists are like, we can't find any evidence of the Xi dynasty. And what they imagine it to be, and they're not entirely wrong, but there's this Erlitou culture in China, okay? And we see this. Remember how the main dynasties are going to start on the Yellow River, okay? So these people, they find this to begin here around 1900. Well, if you go with the Assyrians' kings list, Sargon would have taken that over around 1920. So 20 years after Sargon's taken over, remember, everyone speaks the same language right now. They can pass through and go to Kush, who is up in probably the Ararat region by now. That's where he's ultimately going to be buried, is in Azerbaijan. And then they can travel to the east from there to the Oxus Valley civilization, which is going to be the main cultural hub where they're getting their metal from, because that's who's mining the tin from Afghanistan. And then from there, as these ice caps are melting, what's happening is the Mongols, who these Chinese are going to be intermarried with, the sons of Magog, they're using probably not as much horses right now because they have like this big ice cap, and so there's rivers flowing down all over the place. So it's pretty easy for them to go by river to river to river because they have food and water, right? And so they're going to work their way east, and then they ultimately get to the Yellow River, okay? And so what all they're doing is they're just following river systems up into the mountains and then down to the mountains on the other side. They're just following the ice pack down to where the river systems are, and they're establishing colonies there, and that's what they do. And there are other colonies that are going to come up from down in the south, and these are going to be also Sinaites and Zemrites that mingle in with the Indians, and they're going to come here. And then, but there's also going to be people who are going to come from the north, and they're going to follow these river systems down, and here's the Yellow River. So this is where the Erlitou culture starts. So what this is in 1900, it doesn't work because they trace the Xi dynasty back to 2300, which is right after the flood. Makes a lot of sense if they understand their culture to have been established by Ham and Cush and Sin. Okay, so like Ham is going to be after the flood. He's going to be about 100 years old. If Shem's firstborn son is born 2 years after the flood, you probably have something similar with Ham, and that son is Cush. And so Ham's sons, which are going to be Cush and Mizraim, are some of the older ones, are going to establish Egypt, and then Cush is going to go down to Shinar with Ham, but also his sons are going to expand down the coast of Arabia and into what becomes Sudan and Ethiopia. And then two of his sons, I think he's got like 7 or 9 sons, 2 of them are going to go into India, and that becomes the dark-skinned Indian people, okay? So they're going to start this Erlitou culture. Basically, the nobles who get kicked out of ruling in Shinar, when Ham takes over, they're going to travel to go talk to the Japhethites because they've mostly established this Aksu civilization. That's like their main cultural hub, and this is going to be in what is today like Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan, basically what's north of Afghanistan. And it's going to be this cold culture where it's, they're very crafty, they're crafting thick clothes, and then from there you're going to have people that pioneer out, and they're going to use more hand weapons, less metals, because there's going to be a lot more demand for the metals down in Mesopotamia, where they're building basically the world's grain belt. Essentially, they're using irrigation to build this massive food system, which is shared by the whole world in peace. They're all buying and selling and trading from it, okay? You don't have any issues with famine. Everybody's got plenty of food until Sargon takes over, and that's when you have the first famines recorded, okay? And so when you see these famines recorded in Genesis related to Abraham, Isaac, and then eventually Jacob, these all have to do with overthrows of the Mesopotamian grain belt, because this is just one massive river system with tons of irrigation that is basically producing tons and tons and tons of wheat. And the metal they're getting for their plows and their farm tools and all that stuff is coming from the Oxus civilization. And then that whole system is going to fall apart once the Babel event happens. And so what you end up having here is these other people, you see this early 2 culture over here, and they actually have access to their own tin deposits, okay? So when we look at, and this stuff is going to be in my book too, when we look at the expanse of the Neanderthal people, the Neanderthal people seem to be late generation Nephilim, and so they're shorter, but they're still stronger and stockier, and they become the smaller Yetis and bear men and monkey men, and also the dwarves, because they're in search of routes to the metal in competition to the Canaanites. And one of the places they find and settle around is going to be up here in the Altai Mountains, and it becomes the Chinese source of tin. And so what the Chinese have that's distinct from the rest of the world is most people are getting their tin from the Afghanistan region, and then also secondarily to that from England. And these routes are all established, and you find the Neanderthals mostly venting towards that way before the flood. But this third source, which would have been known to them because the Neanderthals were there. They can literally just follow Neanderthal settlements and bones and stuff like this toward where the tin sources are, because that seems to be what they were sent out for. And the Chinese, because they have their own tin sources, they start a colony right here. And of course, they have all these lowland rivers. And they have massive problems with flooding on these rivers. But remember who Yu Shun was. He was the expert on mitigating flooding in terms of the river systems that were flowing. And so they're the best equipped people in the world to deal with this flooding. Now, what's going to end up happening in their lore is they're going to merge Yu Shun with Noah in their memory, because he mitigates the flooding. And rather than holding on to they do have a myth of a global flood, which is based on a goddess named Nuwa, which sounds a lot like Noah. Well, the reason it is because it is Noah, but in the Shang language, Nu means woman. And so this is after the Tower of Babel. Because Nu means woman, they make Nuwa or Noah a feminine god. And then they have her married to this guy named Fuxi, who is her brother, and they're supposedly the source of all humans. Okay, so you can tell there's something like an inversion of the Noah story, but remember, their patriarch, their savior from the flood, is female. Okay, this is just a reversal. And so we're going to find a Chinese inversion of the patriarchy to the matriarchy in terms of their gods and stuff like this, and this is going to lead to the force being female. Okay, so what happens is they confuse Yu Shun and his ability to mitigate the flooding rivers in the days of Ham with Noah saving the world for the flood. And what they say is that Yu Shun introduced the eating of meat because they weren't able to sow crops for a while. It's going to take years to get enough crops to feed all the people. So in the meantime, you're going to have to introduce the eating of animals. And that's what they credit Yu Shun with doing. Okay. Again, it's the same thing with the Iranians. They take Yima or Yama, who is Ham, and they're talking about the flooding that happens when Ham dies, because, again, this is when most of the sea levels rising is. Remember, all the way out to Taiwan, and this is Taiwan right here, and this region down here through the Philippines and Indonesia and all that stuff, that all used to be contiguous land. Okay, this is why there's more people in India and China than anywhere else in the world, is because that there was a land bridge all the way to Australia, and there used to be tons of farming and easy living, like crops and wild fruits and all this stuff expanding everywhere. And so these people were just able to be fruitful and multiply. Okay, they're not hamstringed in by a lack of food, and so they're just having lots and lots of kids. And then all of a sudden these sea levels rise, and they're all pushed back up into China, India, and Southeast Asia. And that's why, like, to this day, it's something like 40% of the world's population. Maybe it's 30%, but I think it's closer to 40% of the world's population is in China, India, Southeast Asia, and Indonesia. Okay, so just they just were moving away from the rising sea levels, and because of that, they have these other flood stories where you have a brother and sister, or a father and daughter, or a mother and son that think they're trying to repopulate the earth, and that gets carried into the Chinese version of the myth, probably from the south. Okay, so they have Nuwa and Fuxi. One is considered to be the author of writing, and I have a feeling he might be based on Sargon or something. And then Nuwa, who is based on Noah, but is feminized. And these two gods are depicted as having snake bodies because they're following the tradition of the Canaanites, who are depicting their deceased ancestors with snake motifs because they believe they become seraphim, which is what Satan was. Okay, so the seraphim, the word seraph is not just the word for a kind of angel, it's also the word for a fiery serpent. Okay, and so they believe that they're masters of trade and craft and stuff like that. When they die, they become seraphim, which are snake-bodied people. Okay, that's how they believe they become angelic, kind of like what's going to happen to us in the rapture. It says we become angelic. Well, the main angel they follow is Satan, who's the seraph. He's a flaming serpent. Okay, that's why he's called a fiery red dragon. So we have this and again, it's just called the canon of Shun. Shun basically, Shun takes the name of his father-in-law, but he's actually a Cushite. Okay, so we know the Sinaites and Cushites are intermarried, but he's basically got the Sinite people and the Cushite people mostly side with Sargon afterwards because he's a Cushite. Okay, and they probably are similarly what we might consider if an African or an Asian married. That's what they would look like, okay? Well, it just so happens there are people in Africa who have features of the Africans and the Asians, and these are the clicking tongue people. I forget what their names are. It's not the Bantu, the Khoisan people. If you look at Khoisan, they have genetic features of a mixture of African and Asian people. Well, that's because the Cushites originally were. The Cushites and the Sinaites originally were blended together. And so the people who are descended from that blending still carry those traits, while after the Tower of Babel, when people started to isolate more in their familial lines, you see the yellow skin, the Mongoloid eye, and all that stuff kind of consolidating together. But if you go through India and Persia, especially in their history, they depict a lot of their famous people with Chinese eye. Well, why is that? Because those people passed through them for centuries, and then they eventually consolidated here. But between then and then, they were intermarrying with lots of people, and so you would have had those features remaining prominent for a time, and then they would eventually fade it out as people were born with more ethnically homogeneous features. And so the Persians would settle into the look that they have now, which is closer to something between a Mede and an Iraqi and a Turk, which are their surrounding people. The Indians are going to have the Indo-Aryan people in the north and the Dravidian people in the south. But you're going to see a combination of light to dark skin, but more finer kind of Aryan features. And then as you get towards the east, you're going to see a combination of Indian and Asian features. And that's why they call those people Indo-Chinese. They're a mixture of the descendants of Rama and Shiva and the descendants of Sin and Zemar. So they're going to have a combination of those features. And then the Zemarites are going to consolidate down in Mesoamerica and basically become the main reddish Mesoamerican people. And those features are going to spread throughout all the Americas because they are the main cultural civilization who are having the most dominance and the most children. And also they're capturing tribes of other people and sacrificing them. So they end up with a lot more genetic dominance, just like the Han Chinese, who are going to be basically a mixture of these sons of Magog and the sons of Sin up here in the north. When the Han Chinese take over everything in the south, there's a lot of resettlement and ethnic dominance and ethnic cleansing going on. So if you remember, the Qin and the Han are going to build the Great Wall of China, and they literally use a lot of slaves to build it, and then they kill those slaves. So this is why the Han Chinese are going to be the dominant language, that's Mandarin, whereas the recessive language, that's Cantonese, is just probably more Sinite. These whiter, more Mongoloid Chinese are going to dominate them, and that's why they're going to have the dominant language, the dominant amount of people. And then the Chinese are going to spread the Chinese eye among the Mongoloid people, and these people are going to span out as far as, they literally span out as far as like Finland and Estonia and stuff like this, what the Mongols do. And so, like, I've actually met this Finnish, she was like I think she was like a model, but I met her in Columbus, Ohio, and she left modeling and moved back home. But she was really tall, and then she had these very Chinese eye looking eyes, even though she was white, tall, blonde haired, looked like a Scandinavian in every other respect, but she had these very Mongoloid looking eyes. It was just like, that's how far to the west they go. Okay. So when you understand these migrations, and then all this stuff is going to be, again, it's going to be more mixed in the beginning and then more distinct after the Babel event, which is going to be a few hundred years after this. This is kind of where the Chinese history picks up. And so you have this, let's see if we can go to the beginning of this history. The Shu King, that's not English Shu King. That's how this is pronounced. Literally means the Chinese. Qing or King means classic or canon. Shu means history. Okay, so the Shu. Notice it's Shu is the history of the Chinese. Okay, so the canon of Yao is actually the Emperor Shu. And then Shun, or Yao, no, I'm sorry, Yao might be Ham. It might be Ham, and then Shun is Sign. And then Yu Shun is going to be his son-in-law, and that begins the Jia dynasty. So what comes before that leads up to Yu, and then Yu becomes the founding emperor of the Jia dynasty. And all it does is it basically goes through his origin and the stuff that he did in the beginning, and then it skips right to the end of that dynasty, because the people who are really keeping this record are the Shang, and these are the ones who overthrow the Ji around 1600 BC. So they literally are going to jump forward like 500 years to the point where the Shang overthrow it, and so you're going to have some stories related to the late Ji and how they were lazy and corrupt and weren't taking care of the land and stuff like that. And so the Shang are going to bring the idea. These are going to be the Shinites, the Sinites, who leave basically the Babylonian civilization at the Tower of Babel. And they're going to migrate over there. And Tang is going to be that giant Nephilim, the guy who has, it says that the official Chinese script says he was 9 feet tall, with 6 jointed arms, which we know is not a guy who's just got like whatever arms like Stretch Armstrong. He's got 6-fingered hands. That's just a mistransliteration of 6-fingered hands, and that's because the Zhou, it's going to be hundreds of years later, are going to be the ones that translate this. So Tang supposedly is a 9-foot tall giant with 6-fingered hands, which fits the Nephilim description perfectly. We also see the genetics. So there's actually 3 different tribes of proto-humans or Neanderthal type people. There's going to be the Neanderthals, which seem to be the pre-flood Neanderthals that mostly spread to Europe and as far as the Altai Mountains, but they're all in the north because they're avoiding the territory where the Canaanites are before the flood. And then we have these other people, and I think they're called Denisovians, and these names have nothing to do with their origin. They have to do with who discovered them. So you have the Neanderthals are discovered by a German in the Neander Valley. The Denisovians are discovered, I forget who they're discovered by, some guy named Dennis. I'm just kidding, I don't know. And they're mostly in all the places where the Canaanites would have expanded towards the east. So they have Nephilim among them, which makes sense. And then the third group is going to be, it's going to expand down towards East Africa, which is where the Cushites, who would have been mixed with the Sinaites and all the people of Babylonia, that's where they would have expanded after the Tower of Babel. And so what you have is you have Nephilim among them, because those are the Anakim or Anunnaki. And when they spread out after the Tower of Babel, those genes are among them. And so the Denisovians, let's see if we can get this. So if you see these blue, those are the Nephilim that seem to have expanded out from the original settlement. This seems to be where they originate in the yellow, and this is as far east as they expanded. So that's that Altaic Mountain tin mines, and this would be the region that's kind of north of the Afghanistan tin mines, which the Canaanites would have controlled. But they would have settled near there because what they seem to be is establishing, like, these guys eat meat and they hunter and gather while everybody else is not eating meat. And so they're sending them out to explore and find it. And then they start these tribes afterwards. And then the humans follow after them, and they are intermarrying with them. And then they get to those tin sources, and then they eventually reject the Neanderthals and box them out and start killing them. And then the Neanderthals start eating themselves and eating humans and all kinds of crazy stuff because they're isolated from food and society. The main divisions of these people, and this is where they found them. So again, you have the Heidelbergensis, and again, that's Heidelberg is a place in Germany. This is based on who finds them, and you see where these people are, see? So this realm right here would have been Cushites. So Cush starts here, and then his descendants come here. And remember, these are genetic traces. This is not necessarily that they're Nephilim in all these places. These are people with isolations of genes that we can trace to the Neanderthal bloodline. So notice the first ones. Notice where they are. Canaan. That's one of the first locations of these people, okay? So the Canaanites we know are making Nephilim, but this also seems to be, notice you have Canaan and down here. And if you look at this other Neanderthal map, they believe one of the first places they come from is, surprise, surprise, here's another map of this stuff, is Sumer to the west of the Euphrates River. So right down here, they believe this is, they're like, oh, this seems to be one of the first places where Neanderthals and humans were breeding with each other. Oh, it just happens to be where Gilgamesh, where Inanna, who's the mistress of heaven, is worshipped, and Gilgamesh is considered this part god giant king. And Enkidu is his buddy, and so it seems like in this area to this area was where the Nephilim started at the first, and they spread all the way out to here. Notice this is Neanderthal, Homo sapiens, and then it says there's a mixture with Denisovians. Well, why is there a mixture with Denisovians? Well, remember, these genetics are still going to be retained in some people, okay? So even if you hold to the theory that Noah being pure in all of his generations means he was genetically pure, which is possible, the context of the word generations they use is not a genetic term. You have two terms for generation in the Hebrew, one meaning the era, and talking about my generation, my era, right? And then the other is the generation of, in terms of the descendancy of, okay? So one's genetic and one is temporal, okay? And the one they talk about Noah being righteous in his generations does not have to do with his genetics, it has to do with his time, okay? So he was righteous compared to the people of his era who were all murdering each other, basically, okay? So we have this original dispersal of the Neanderthal people, which seems to be based around the hunt for tin. Then we have a secondary dispersion, and this is simple. Remember, the Babylonians consist of Semitic peoples, Canaanite peoples, and Cushite peoples. That's the main Babylonian civilizational culture, okay? After the Babel incident, the ones who are mingled with Cushite people, which, remember, they have it's the Amorites who run the Babylonian civilization, and they have Nephilim. They have the Anunnaki or Anakim with them, okay? So whatever Cushites would have had, these Nephilim, because they're big and strong and powerful and help the Amorites take over, they would have been nobility. And so their descendants would have carried those Nephilim genes, and the Cushite ones go down here. You see different places in Africa where they spread. Notice this is the Cushite heartland, but they're going to be also down here among Oman and Yemen. And then the Canaanite ones are going to go east, and they're going to mostly consolidate around China and also down here into Indonesia, because remember, this was all contiguous land at one point in time. And so you're going to have these post-flood Nephilim genetics among them. They're like, oh, these prove species evolution. No, these prove exactly what the Bible says, which is Nephilim, which is that human angelic hybrids created these other people, and they were strong, they were bulky, but also, as the Bible testifies, over the generations, they eventually get shorter. So we see Og, king of Bashan, has a 13-foot bed. Goliath is said to be 9 feet tall in the Masoretic and like 7 feet tall in the Septuagint. So we don't know which one of those is correct, but what we know is they're shrinking. They shrink over time. Why? Because what we know about Neanderthals and what we have from silence, an argument from silence regarding Nephilim, we don't find any female Nephilim. And what seems to happen is the Nephilim mostly come out male until they've interbred with humans long enough to eventually start producing female. But those females they produce are super butch and ugly. Just gonna be honest. That's where your tomboy genetics probably come from, honestly. That's probably where your tomboy genetics come from, and there's probably a lot of roots for lesbianism in that, I would imagine, okay? But they look butch, they're super thick, they're super tough, and they also don't breed well. They have a high instances of not carrying a child to term. So a lot of, not abortions, but miscarriages. This is what the geneticists who study Neanderthals say. And so they mark in the genetic evidence that there seems to have been a preference for Neanderthal men marrying human women, which would make a lot of sense if these people were the ones who were originally finding the routes to the tin, and they could trade. Literally, they're not crafting in the metal, they're using the stone tools. They're super strong, they eat meat, and they use stone tools, but they're trading the tin that they're finding to the humans who are using it to make war against the Canaanites. That's what they're doing. And so you find their settlements within range of these 10 miles. Sometimes they could be like 50 to 100 miles away, but that's because they don't want to go there and get killed, because that's where the Canaanites are. They're hunting and gathering and wandering around there, and they're strong and they have stone tools, and so they're fighting once in a while. But they're getting shorter and shorter until they get to around a few inches shorter than the average human height today. But they're built like beasts. And so this is where you get, remember, the Japhethites are going to retrace their steps afterwards, and they're going to follow this. This is where you get the legends of dwarves from. They're stocky as crap, they're red-haired, and then they are in search of metals. These are the dwarves, and they're super strong, and they have really strong hands and good grips, and they're very athletic, okay? This is where the dwarves come from. This is also from where, if you remember, when we were talking about Native American stuff, there are, I think it's either Hopi or Apache legends of giants who live there, but when they find the giants, they're red-haired, but they're not giant size. Well, that's because their term for giants does not mean tall person, it means genetic Nephilim, okay? And the giants are a different breed of hominid, and they come out very red-haired and all this stuff, okay? So it's interesting how these genetic traits also are found in Esau. Esau is not a Nephilim because he's a twin with Jacob, but those, again, these are genetic recessive traits and stuff like that that still keep popping up in humans because once upon a time they were interbred with them. Okay? Now, there is no link between this interbreeding and whether or not a person can get saved or is righteous. But we do know at least some Nephilim seem to be the basis for demons. So there might be, the originals might be like considered demonic, and then as they're marrying and interbreeding with humans after that, they might eventually be a human in terms of the disposition of their soul. We don't really know this. We're not going to speculate too much on this. Every human is eligible for salvation, but this idea of demons being Nephilim spirits was held all the way into like the 5th century AD. Okay. So very, very clear evidence there, and that leads us to Tang. That leads us to Tang, who is the founder of the Shang dynasty. He is going to bring with him the Shang bone script. He's going to bring in with him this divination that is based on a turtle shell, which is where they write the bone script, and they use like fire and stuff like that to make these symbols. The Chinese seem to have had astrology before that. But these guys are going to advance more divination, and that divination is going to ultimately be summarized. It starts out in this turtle shell thing, and it ends up in the I Ching, okay? And again, it's going to talk about the Tang overthrow and why they're just and some of the things they do, and then it's going to skip to these kings that were righteous and then these kings that were unrighteous and the justification for the Zhao to overthrow them. So the Zhao are going to overthrow them around the 1600s, and they're going to, around 1086 BC. And they're going to continue as a political dominion all the way down into around 220 BC. But they have this period called the Spring and Autumn period where they're losing their dominance over the other states. And so their feudal lords are getting more and more autonomy. It's very similar to what happens in Europe as the Holy Roman Empire breaks up. It's very, very similar to that. And so these states are gaining more and more power, and then eventually these states are going to go to war, each one claiming to have the mandate of heaven and the right to take over China and rule again, and that turns into the Warring States period. And the Warring States period is after this. So remember, this is Confucius writing this, when the Zhou are still, they're more of a first among equals, so it is kind of a confederacy of aligned systems. And you want to think of their religions similar to Catholic Europe, where everyone's Catholic, but the nations are starting to break apart, okay? So it's very similar to that. And then what Confucius is doing is he compiles this. He compiles the Book of Rites, which are basically all of their cultural, moral, and ethical and traditional standards of respect and stuff like that. He compiles the Book of Odes, which is kind of like their psalms, but they're not considered to be divinely inspired. They're considered to be historical psalms of things people say about heaven, and you have statements ranging from fatalistic determinism, like there's nothing you could do, the way of heaven is just going to be as it is, to like more... no, the way of heaven rewards good and punishes evil. So you have belief systems about God ruling that are range from being closer to what the Bible teaches to closer to what the Cainite, fatalistic determinists, or Calvinists teach. That's what you have in the Chinese system. And then the final piece of that is the I Ching, which is basically their version of the prophets, which is based on a combination of poetry about the changing seasons and then astrological patterns combined with these hexagrams that they use it's like casting lots, basically. So it's a similar combination of the prophets and the system. If you remember, the Levites had the Urim and Thummim, except way more based on randomness and chance and believing that these outcomes are the determination of the heavens or heaven. And that's how they look at God, as more like an almost deistically, like the heavens is God and the stars are what we can read to determine God's will. And then we can perform these casting lots things to get down to what decisions we should make in relation to those things. That's basically what the I Ching is, okay? So that is the Chinese culture of Confucius, and then the Confucian Analects is basically Confucius's book that is describing his rationalization for ethics, basically, within the context of all these things, okay? So that's the Confucian system. That is the prevailing system at the end of the Zhou period. But then after that comes Lao Tzu. So Lao Tzu is accredited with writing the Tao Te Ching, the Tao Te Ching. This is literally means, remember, Ching means classic or canon. Tao means the way, and the Te means essentially virtue. So what you'd say is the canon of the way of virtue, or the canon of the virtue of the way, okay? So you have the mandate of heaven, which is basically the decree over who rules from heaven, and then you have the way of heaven, which is like the Dharma, or the fundamental cosmic law, okay? Again, God is basically deistic in their system, but the way of heaven is very much a counterfeit Holy Spirit. It is in every way a counterfeit Holy Spirit. And it's interesting that it translates to the way. Te just means like virtue, or the Greeks would call this arate or something like that. It just, what this basically means is this is the law, and this is what is just for your behavior based on the law, okay? And this is made by Lao Tzu. Now, here's the thing. I have the gift of discerning the spirits, and I can tell you how this is manifested in me, and I've learned to understand it more as I've gotten older, is when I would, whether it's songs or things that have an origin with demons or worldliness or whatever, when I would listen to that too much, I would get deeply influenced by it. And I would realize in a very pronounced way, it would affect my soul. Like, it feels dark. It feels like it's taking over. Literally to the point of, like, if you keep reading this, it's going to drive you insane. This is how I used to be, even as a Christian. I found this with books like the Quran, with books like having to do with like psychology, where they're advocating getting back to our Babylonian roots and exposing kids to sex when they're 3 years old. This is a book that was recommended to me by a pastor. Okay, I've since learned to understand. Okay, you're feeling this way because these words came from satanic spirits. Okay, men were inspired and helped by Satan in the same way that the biblical writers were helped by the Holy Spirit to create these writings. These are not just simply human speculation. And when you read them and you read their very words, it's very clear that these are demonically inspired. Okay? Now, that being said, I have, I believe I've got God's authorization to be studying all this stuff to write this book. But I have had to pray through the reading of several of these books because I can feel it pressing into my mind, like trying to gain control and power over my mind. This is how words work. Remember, the gospel is the word, and it's a seed that comes in and grows within you and sets you free. Satan's words try to captivate you and control you. Okay? So the word of God makes us free. The word of Satan brings us into captivity. This is how Adam and Eve were brought into captivity by Satan, because they listened to him instead of God. Okay? So I'm saying all that to say this. Of all the writings, including Greek, I'm reading Greek philosophy that's openly talking about pederasty being good, and I'm not feeling the effects of it, okay? Of all the writings I have ever read in my life that come from another religion, the ones that have had that effect on me the most are the Quran, the Upanishads, and more than any others, the Tao Te Ching. To the point where it's like, the first time I read it, it was intense. Like, it felt like something dark was trying to push into my ear. And it's always on the right side of my head I feel this, okay? It felt like something dark was trying to push into my ear. And I prayed over it and got through reading it and, was able to resist that. But even the second time I read it, like the Upanishads, I can go through and flip through and, look for different citations and quotes for the things that I'm pointing to in my book to show this is what they believe and this is their BS lies. This is how they come out. The Upanishad is different because the Upanishad uses the mystery of these confused parallelisms, and they're called logisms, which is basically like proofs of logic that aren't necessarily rational, and they have to do with etymological fallacies, numerological coincidence, and then just claims of authority that have to do with things that aren't verifiable, basically. Okay, and what the Upanishads does is it draws you in through these mysteries of, think about this word. Now think about the 3 letters in this word. Now think about how this corresponds to this, and this corresponds to this, and this corresponds to this. And it draws you through a lot of meditations on eventually revealing what they are saying, which is a lie. Okay? But because you're trying to understand the logic of what they're saying, by the time you get to the lie, it's pretty persuasive. Because your mind is naturally trying to make sense of what they're rationalizing without knowing where it's heading. And this is how a lot of Gnosticism works. This is why Irenaeus would write about Gnosticism and say, these guys gradually take you through these levels of mysteries, and Freemasonry is the same thing, until what they arrive at is that good is evil, up is down. It's the opposite of the truth. Well, Brahmanism of the Upanishads and the Hindu meditation seem to be the earliest version of that. And what we get in Gnosticism is those same types of reasoning imported from the East to the West. And one of the first people I find doing stuff like this is Parmenides, who's a pederast, and Socrates, who's a pederast. And this is where sophistry or rhetoric comes from. It's people wrangling words to confuse people as to their meaning and rationalization so as to be able to manipulate them this way or that way in terms of what is true. Okay? And even though Socrates was much more of a logician than Parmenides, who was a sophist, he was very influenced by Parmenides, because Parmenides was one of the OG renowned philosophers when Socrates was a youth. And so there's a lot of respect in his arena for Parmenides, and a lot of what Socrates attempts at getting towards a more consistent logical paradigm is rooted in the ideas that come from Pythagoras down through Parmenides. And it's not until Aristotle, Plato's student, that they start to be looking at those ideas more critically and calling BS on a lot of them and getting to more refined logical bases for things. Now, they're still rooted in their culture, and they're still rooted in value systems, and his is ultimately going to be rooted in a combination of might makes right plus these things that are rooted in the gods and where beliefs and what is good and evil comes from. But the point is they're further away from these weird rationalizations. And I would say Aristotle is much further away from the pederasty culture. He doesn't seem to be about that. Plato doesn't seem to be either. I know Plato's married. Socrates has a wife, but it seems like she's a beard, because he has like a wife and like young kids by the time he's in his 70s. And it was standard for you to eventually produce kids or you weren't considered a good person. So it's by that time that, again, Aristotle mentors Alexander the Great, who's also bi and thinks he's a god. So it's not like the culture has really changed all that much. It's that the philosophy is changing, and the philosophy of Aristotle and other guys like Democritus and I forget his name, but Xenophanes, or whoever the guy who starts to attribute anthropomorphisms to the gods and say, real God is not emotional and all that stuff. Those things are going to come into Roman Catholicism. And for instance, like Aristotle is going to heavily influence Thomas Aquinas, and the more rational, which leads to the more secular in the Roman Catholic sphere, is going to be rooted in Aristotle. The more Calvinistic ideas is going to be rooted in the anthropomorphistic ideas of Xenophanes, I believe his name is. I'm probably getting that wrong, though. This is going to be in my book, but it's the guy who basically first starts to criticize Hesiod's gods and like real gods don't act like this. And here's what they're doing is they're just projecting. And then the Christians start to say that, oh yeah, God's just using anthropomorphisms to make himself known in a human-like way, but he's not really like that. So they're basically saying God's lying. He's just, it's kind of an analogous to what God's like, but God doesn't really feel in a way that he's affected by what anything we do. He's just a big, consistent, non-moving, immovable object, because they're getting those ideas from Aristotle too, but they predated him and go back to Parmenides and stuff like that. So we get to the Tao Te Ching. Again, Confucius is more like the embodiment of the historical, if you will, Chinese Bible. Okay, if you look at the 5 classics as like their Bible, it is not rooted in the creation story. It has very limited interaction with any gods. They acknowledge the existence of gods and spirits and ancestral spirits. The Tang hold to a Prince of Spirits, which is Shangdi, but it's based on sign. And then he's under heaven, and then the emperor would be considered as high priest and son of heaven, but the Zhou aren't like that. The Zhou hold to more of a, not a high priesthood-based system, but like a system of just governance, where traditions of general ancestor reverence, sacrifices to the ancestors are carried out. Some cultures like try to appease nature spirits, which are based on demons. But the Zhou mostly are agnostic about these things. Even Confucius would say you shouldn't be honoring any spirits except your own ancestors. Anyone who's doing other than that is trying to flatter the gods, essentially, towards getting ahead socially and politically, basically. He's like, if you're virtuous, you should only be honoring your own ancestors. And it's just their, it's their version of patron saints, which the Catholics practice, combined with honoring your mother and father. And one of the key virtues of Confucius is based on Ham's sin towards Noah, because he literally says, he's talking to a guy in the Analects, and this guy says, this man in our village was considered very righteous because when his father stole a sheep, he told the state on his father. So they considered that just, which would be closer to the Mosaic Code. Okay, but Confucius says that's not how we see justice. In our belief system, a man covers up the sin of his father. So they look at Ham being apparently cursed or not blessed and exposing Noah's sin as something they're trying to rectify by saying, okay, the rule is then you cover up the sins of your father. In other words, if your father commits a crime, you don't tell on him. That's literally what they believe, okay? And that is fundamental to Confucius's moral ethic, okay? And you're going to have guys like Lao Tzu and Mozi criticize that, because Moism is basically a system where everybody should be loved equally. God loves everyone equally. I'm going to say God, but they mean heaven. Okay. God rewards good and punishes evil, and that should be it should be universal. His ethic is much closer to the Mosaic Code than Confucianism or Taoism. Taoism is totally different than any of these, and here's what this is. Taoism basically looks at the way of heaven and the mandate of heaven and fate and these things as just going through a process of turning over. So if you were to look at the Taoist, notice this right here. This picture right here is basically, this is the Taoist paradigm, if you will. And these are the trigrams that are used with the I Ching for divination. And there's 8 of them. And surprise, surprise, guess what one of their representations are? Is a mother and father who are also brother and sister, because that's their perverted flood story. And then 3 sons and daughters who are also brother and sister. So what they're doing is they're merging the Noahic family with the Eastern version of the flood, which is based on the secondary flood of incest relations to repopulate the earth, and it's manifesting these trigrams. Now they also have other parallelisms having to do with forces of nature and cosmological forces or whatever. But this is the point, is these are used in divination. I don't know what these Chinese symbols mean. And then this represents the overarching dharma or way or the law of heaven and how heaven operates, okay? This thing is a feminine spirit. She describes herself as a mother of all. Basically, it's literally the exact feminine opposite of Plato's Timaeus. So in Plato's Timaeus, you have basically the true God is ineffable, can't be described with words, blah, blah, blah. And these ideas, I was taught in seminary about Presbyterianism, okay? That God is ineffable and he can't really be described with words, okay? That is a lie, because that's like saying God can't describe himself with words and he's the word. Yes, he can, okay? He can do this. These are them putting limitations on God, and it comes from paganism. It does not come from the Bible, okay? Well, in the Greek Eastern system, basically God is ineffable, and then the Logos is the effable ideal of who God is. So he's kind of a firstborn of God, but they don't call him God, but he's basically a reflection of God that can be idealized, can be understood. And then the universe was called the only begotten of God. Okay, so the universe itself was a temporal manifestation of the Logos. Okay, so Plato's realm of forms is the idea of, like, imagine a heaven, like a perfect universe that never is free from the laws of thermodynamics and corruption and stuff like that. Okay, that's how he sees the Logos. It's an idea of a perfect form of what the universe is manifested. And think of it like if you were to press your face or your print into the sand and the waves would slowly wash it away. That's how they see the universe, as almost exactly as Hebrews describes God and Jesus. Like it says he's basically the perfect imprint of his hypostasis or understanding. That's literally what essence means. It means he is the visible representation of who God is understood to be, which is why Jesus can say, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. The Father is invisible. It's not like Jesus is like, yeah, God looks like me, but in spirit form. No, he's invisible, okay? So the visible understanding of who God is manifest in Christ. And Christ behaves in time like God the Father would behave if he were in time. He looks like God. This is why man is made in God's image, okay? He is his person is manifested in this. So we don't think of God as a divine hive mind or something like the AI brain they're trying to create. We think of God like a person. He's a person. He is like Christ, only unrestrained by time and space. Okay? So they don't think like that. They think like this because the ultimate manifestation of God to them is not a person, it's the universe itself, and the Taoists are the exact same way. The only difference is where the Logos is masculine, the way, the Tao is feminine, which is interesting because both the way and the Logos are used in the Bible to describe Jesus. So you see how they're Antichrist. They're ripping off ideas that ultimately belong to Jesus, and you have a masculine version of one and a feminine version of one in Greece and China. Okay, this is the East-West paradigm. This is the two daughters of the original wickedness that comes from Shinar. Because again, these Shinar, which is the original China, these are the Canaanites, and the Canaanites, with the help of the Danites, spread this stuff to the Greeks in the West. And then through the Mongoloids and the Indians, they coalesce here in China in the East. And so you have a masculine version and a feminine version, which I suggest to you, Mystery Babylon will be the marriage of these two. The masculine and feminine of the same lie, okay? Now, when you get down to the Tao, again, more than anything, and first of all, this is the last of these systems in terms of the historical order of their coming out, okay? This is the last of the great mystical systems that all the Gnostic stuff is derivative of this. All the OGs are Brahmanism down through Buddhism, Confucianism down through Taoism and Mohism, but Mohism actually it doesn't get picked up by any empire or something like that, and so it doesn't really last. And then you have Pythagoras down through Plato. Those are the main systems. And then the Greeks win and take over the world, and they start consolidating all this stuff in the Alexandrian library, and that's where Gnosticism is born. Okay, so everything in Gnosticism and New Age is just derivative of Gnosticism. It's just going through this exact same process that they went through with the Library of Alexandria, except they're doing it with a Theosophical Society and different mystical groups that ultimately merge into the UN, the United Nations. Okay, so so this is what they're talking about, is being ineffable. It says the way that can be walked is not the way, the name that can be named is not the name. What they're ultimately saying is that, now remember, if you think of the way, this is the God of forces. So the force in Star Wars is entirely based on this. And so when you hear about in Daniel that he worships, the Antichrist gives honor to a God of forces, okay? Well, the God of forces is ultimately Satan, but the manifestation of who he is. Remember, Satan is an androgynous monad, okay? He's an angel, and he has no spouse. It's different. See, God is the Father, Spirit, and the Son, three persons in a unity. Satan is just himself, and so he's the only thing he loves. Okay, and so he's going to have masculine and feminine manifestations of his same degree, and these are the daughters of Shinar. Okay, the first one is going to be the false pantheon that's developed under Sargon and Henduada in Shinar. And then it's going to turn into these systems that go east and west, and the ultimate manifestations of these are in Chinese communism, which is literally just materialism, and then Western capitalism. Those are the economic, political systems that are the manifestations of Mystery Babylon. But underneath them are the dynamics of their mystery cults, which is the Greek philosophies in the West. It's the Chinese and Indian mysteries in the East, okay? And it says the way this can be walked is not the way, a name that can be named is not the name. So in other words, God is not ineffable. God is ineffable, and there is no good and evil. That's what they're saying, okay? The Tao is both named and nameless. A nameless, it is the origin of all things. As named, it is the mother of all things. So this is what they're saying. It's ultimately ineffable, but if you were to call it something, it's the mother of everything, okay? So it says, a mind free of thought, merged within itself, holds the essence of the Tao, or the way. A mind filled with thought identifies its own perceptions, beholds the mere forms of this world. So what are they saying? Our goal is to be united to this thing as a hive mind that doesn't think for itself and just ultimately flows with whatever way the Tao wants to go. AKA, get the mark of the beast and do whatever Satan wants. That's literally what this is, okay? It says the Tao and this world seem different, but in truth they are only one and the same. The only difference is what we call them. Okay, that is called monism. The universe and everything is the same. Okay, that is called monism. That is Parmenides, and again, Parmenides was guided in his understanding. This is, you can read his poem on nature. He's guided by what he calls the goddess, and the goddess is a woman that sits in the center of the universe that manipulates the forces of light and dark, good and evil, masculine and feminine, in this like never-ending dance. Okay, he's describing the Tao exactly. Okay, this is what this represents. Okay, what this is showing you, this is the light side and dark side of the force, and this is the way, and this is what the entire corpus of the Star Wars mythology is ultimately bringing to you. Okay, it starts out with the idea of these Jedi, which are these good guys, and these Sith, which are these bad guys, okay? Light and darkness. But what it's leading to, both with Luke Skywalker and Rey Palpatine, is that the truth is somewhere in the middle. The Force is not either it's not Sith evil and Jedi good. It's forces of light and darkness, some being more based on dominance, control, and passions, and others being based more on fluid, non-reactive, non-control. Okay, so think of these as like Kung Fu and Tai Chi. Okay, now Kung Fu happens to be rooted in Buddhism, and Tai Chi is rooted in Taoism. But that's an example of how the two of these things interact. And what Taoism is going to teach you is that the universe just keeps expanding and contracting. And this is what Buddhism teaches too. and that it keeps going through these cycles of the light dominating and the dark dominating. And if you get into Star Wars lore, you'll have eras of thousands of years of the Sith dominating the universe in an empire, and then thousands of years of the Jedi dominating in the empire. Okay? And they're rooted in two different peoples. One are originally called the Jedi, and one are originally called the Sith. And they're races of beings, although the Jedi are a bunch of people chosen based on their force sensitivity, and the Sith are basically one race. But there's different people before that, and there's you can get into all the Star Wars lore of people who are like this alien race who conquered the universe and made the Star Forge and conquered the universe by trying to control the Force, and then these people by letting the Force move through them and control them, okay? And so the idea of these things are basically, there's not good and evil, there's just these flows like waves going back and forth, but what this represents is the darkness is preserved in the light, and the light is preserved in the darkness. So I had a friend describe this to me in high school, and she was kind of into this. She was like, oh, it means there's some good in every evil and some evil in every good. So think about Star Wars. Darth Vader has murdered a bunch of little kids. He is murdering people left and right. Murder, 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 murder. He's nothing but murder and corruption, okay? Based on his fear, based on his evil, based on wanting what he wants at the expense of everybody else. He's willing to sacrifice millions to save Padme, basically, which is the one woman he wants. Well, why? Because he's selfish, because he's evil. Okay? He's also committed genocide before that because some people did something to his mom. He chooses what he wants over everything else in the universe. That's his thing. But Luke says, oh, but there's still good in you. I know it. I know there's good in you. Why? Why do you think that, Luke? Because he's a Taoist. Because in the biggest tidal wave of evil, there's still in the center of it good. And in the biggest tidal wave of good, in the center of it, there's still evil. Now think about how that rings true in the flesh, okay? I mean, in the best Christians, there's still sin. And in the worst sinners, there's still hope. See, in the natural, if you just observe it in the natural, it's like, oh, yeah, that rings true. Because why? Because it's not speaking to the progression of becoming from the image of God to the likeness of God, which was God's plan all along, history having a beginning and an end. It's based on the never-ending cycle of history, which is like, oh, what's happening? Oh, the churches are turning corrupt now. And what it gets you to do is view the great apostasy as just a natural cycle. These things just ebb and flow. They come and go. The world is much older, much, 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 much older than you would imagine. And there is no beginning or end to history. And there is no beginning to the end of the universe. And this is just the lightness and the dark folding back over each other like tides and waves, going back and forth and back and forth. And what the Taoists would say is, just go with it. Don't resist. Don't fight it. Don't try to control the government. They're very libertarian. The less laws, the better. They even make room for violence, but they're saying, but just use it when you need to. Don't be dispassionate about it. Don't, if you got to kill somebody, don't do it out of hate and anger. Just kill them because it's needful for the moment, And so this is where Tai Chi will allow for things like that. And so we have this ebb and flow of good and evil, and the Taoists would say, just go with it, let it happen. Okay? We're not fighting against the darkness. We're not, it's not our job to control it and cause it to happen. These are just the natural flows of things. And where I found this the most seductive is there is so much of the way they frame this. Like if you don't know the basic theology and the lies that are, that it's rooted in, a lot of this kind of sounds like the Christian walk. It's not our job to control things, but it's different. Because in the Christian walk, we are not controlling things because we are here on an ambassadorial mission of peace from heaven that is ultimately going to culminate in a conquest from heaven. So we are the peace mission, and when the peace mission gets rejected by the world ultimately in the killing of Christians worldwide, that's when the peace is done, the ambassadors get pulled out, and the war comes. This is God saying, I had a plan all along to make you like God, and the Christians are here to teach you the way in which God intends you to make you like God. But Satan says, no, 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 no. See how this matches so much to the light side and the dark side? No, 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 no. The way you become by God is by disobeying God and taking his power. And the Christians say, no, no, no. The way you become like God is by submitting to his power. Okay? So you see, the reason this is so seductive is that if you just take it in its generic form and you take Christianity in its generic form away from the divine revelation, the source, and the true history of it, boy, they sound very similar ethically. Very similar. And that's because this is Mystery Babylon. Okay? And the way this is going to be framed in the end times, you're going to have Christians deceived into the one world religion under Antichrist, and other Christians, remember, I'm talking Christians in the professing sense, not in the born again sense. Other Christians who are going to be in the control group fight against this and control it. So the dominionist Christians versus the lukewarm, licentious, I'll spew you out of my mouth Christians, Laodicea. Okay? And you're going to have Sardis, which they say you have a name that you're alive, but you're dead. And Christ warns them if they don't repent, they're going to be aligned against him when he comes to fight with the sword of his mouth. And then you have the Laodicean Christians who are just like, oh, it's all just hippie goodness. And, I can tell you I'm in Phoenix, and it's probably much worse in California. The mixing of New Age therapeutic protocols and the live and let live ethos, where people are very comfortable flipping between New Age terminology and Christian terminology, is all over the place here. Okay? You see these things in the bigger, more expansive mega churches, especially out here and in California and all the way up through, especially Redding. It's very prominent. And then you have the Christian nationalists. So what are we seeing here in this false, we were to project this onto a false Christian paradigm? We're seeing the charity-based postmillennialism of the liberal Calvinists and the dominion-based postmillennialism of the Christian nationalist Calvinists. And of course, we see both of those things in the NAR. One is like just go with the flow and kind of adopt New Age language and all this stuff, and this is just what God is doing. He's bringing forth heaven. And then others are going to get more involved in the political sphere and say, we're taking dominion, we're forcing this, we're conquering the demons and all this language, okay? No, we're ambassadors. We don't conquer, nor do we sit there and become the culture. We are distinct from the culture. We have an authority over us from another land that we still are citizens of, and we're on an ambassadorial mission that we take seriously. And so we imbibe the culture to the degree to show friendship, but not to conform to it. We're here to tell you our king is coming to take over, and we're asking you to submit and understand that he loves you and he's better. Submit, because you're currently under the dominion of Satan. And so what we see here is utterly incompatible with Christianity. But if you are just reduce it down to its ethical paradigm, boy, that works with this Calvinism and this, these links between, that's like the liberal Calvinists and that's like the conservative Calvinists. And it's just an ebb and flow, and it's just a nature. And sometimes this one dominates and sometimes that one dominates. And the ultimate manifestation of these two things is going to be the empire of the Antichrist, the false light, and then the conquering kings of the East, the false darkness. They're both evil. They're both evil. But that's where this is all going, and Taoism is the ultimate vehicle, if you will, to advancing that program forward. It's made after everything from Brahmanism to Platonism and all that stuff are made. It seems to be, at least. The book, the earliest versions of this book we find are from about 300 BC. They say they go back to Tao, but there are people who claim Tao is much older. Some people say he kind of condescended to Confucius, so he's before him. Other people say he was Buddha. Other people say he taught Buddha. So they're trying to place him earlier in the past, and he probably is somewhat contemporary with Confucius. So you could put Confucius, Socrates, and Buddha all in the same generation. But that's like the final generation of this series. And what you have in Plato, remember, most of Plato's writings are talking about Socrates and his thoughts. Plato might be advancing those thoughts somewhat, but he's mostly documenting Socrates' thoughts. And then Aristotle is actually critiquing those thoughts. Okay, so, but what we have here, let's see here. It says the Tao in this world see different, they are the same. Okay, here we go. It says those who have the Tao want nothing else. Those seemingly empty, they are ever full. Those seemingly old, they are beyond the reach of birth and death. So you see how that compatible that statement is to Christianity, that the Tao sounds like the Holy Spirit. That's the whole point, is for the Tao to sound like the Holy Spirit. Okay. Universal recapitulation. It says, see all things flourish and dance in endless variation, and once again merge back into perfect emptiness, their true repose, their true nature, emerging, flourishing, dissolving back again. This is the eternal process of return. This is exactly what Parmenides taught in monism. Okay. It says, when the Tao is present, action arises from one's own heart. When the greatness of the Tao is absent, action comes from rules of kindness and justice. So they're basically saying, if we walk in the way, the Tao, we don't need any laws or rules. Okay. The sun in all its glory reveals but a passing world. Only the inner night illumines eternity. Only the light can guide us back home. So the idea is the same old New Age lie that we were always gods and we need to return to source, rather than we were made by God and we need to be conformed to his image and likeness. Okay? So that's something God is doing to us if we submit to him, not something that we are going back to. And this going back, again, is in Origen's theology, which creeps into the Catholic Church low-key. Okay? Trying to find the one where it talks about... oh, I know. This is where she admits, the Spirit admits to being Mystery Babylon. Okay, remember, the origin of China is Shinar. This is what this Spirit says. Endlessly creating, endlessly pulsating, the Spirit of the Valley never dies. She is the hidden creator. Remember where this all starts, in the Valley of Shinar. Okay? Although she becomes the whole universe, her immaculate purity is never lost. Remember Inanna, who in Hinduwada was the priestess of Nana and Inanna, it was considered the original Mother Virgin. So her immaculate purity is never lost. Boy, that sounds a lot like Catholic Mary. Because it is. It's the same demon. She has various forms throughout the earth. Listen what it says. Although she assumes countless forms, her true identity remains intact. That is the Catholic Mary. That is Inanna. That is Ishtar. Whatever we see or don't see, whatever exists or doesn't exist, is nothing but the creation of this supreme power. What is he saying? All religions are the way. Her many forms, remember the mother of harlots, her many forms are all her. Tao is unlimited, so the way is limitless, unborn, eternal. It can only be reached through the hidden creator. She is the very face of the absolute. In other words, she's God. The gate to the source of all things eternal. Now, listen to her voice, hear it echo through the creation. Without fail, she reveals her presence. Without fail, she brings us to her own perfection. What is she saying? This is Mystery Babylon saying, come to me. It's just a matter of gravity. You'll eventually get here, and you will all conform to source and return to what? Your status as gods. Because you're all God. You're all one. You're all God. Okay? This is Antichrist. This is pure Antichrist. It makes me sick to even be saying it. Like I can feel this in my mouth and my tongue, like how and evil this is. Okay? This is Mystery Babylon. Now, I'm going to show you how this compares to what is said about Mystery Babylon in the Bible. And this is going in my book. And again, this book is going to be solid by the time it's done. In terms of like growing your discernment and understanding how the world unfolded, by the time you get to Gnosticism, you're just going to be like, meh. Because I'm just shredding these things down to their basic ideas and what ends up being opposing Scripture. So again, remember, the early Greek philosophical tradition starts with Solon of Athens, who goes to Egypt and gets the Atlantis myth, and then ends with Parmenides. who is the guy who teaches something exactly like Taoism. Okay, that's all before Socrates. The evolution of the Hindus starts with Vedism and goes down to Buddhism, and it has the Maitreya. Buddha teaches the Maitreya, which is the coming end days Buddha from their perspective, who leads the world into righteousness, not destruction. But the universe naturally expands and contracts, so there is a natural, if you will, destruction, not a judgment. Okay. And then China starts with, honestly, it starts with Tang the Nephilim, and it goes down to Mozi is probably the later version of it, but he doesn't take off. Lao Tzu, Sun Tzu, and these guys. Sun Tzu just believes might makes right. He's closer to like an Aristotle or Alexander the Great. Lao Tzu is the Taoist, and he's somewhere between the 6th and 4th century. It's hard to tell. But based on everything I've read about these other mysteries that are popping up, it seems very clear that he's the capstone of these Antichrist religions, okay? And he seems to be around the same time as Socrates. And Socrates is saying something very different, but he is trying to justify pederasty in his writings, and he is also admittedly demon-possessed. And so he is more interacting with the ideas that come before them, and Aristotle does that with a lot more organization and self-control. He seems to be more of a thinker, whereas Socrates was a demonized. He called himself a seer, so he was a false prophet. Okay, where Aristotle is more of an analyst, and Plato is more of basically he's trying to realize Aristotle's or Socrates' vision through his academy, and that ultimately breaks off into two schools. One becomes Aristotle's school that is much more based on logical ethics and government and power and control, and then the other is Stoicism, which comes out of Plato's school, and that is more based on exercising self-control in order to become one with the Logos, which they see as like the Logos would be like a god within an eternal universe that is kind of flowing around, and we get absorbed back into it, and then we get reincarnated back out of it. So that would fit very well with Buddhism or Taoism. Okay. It actually is very compatible with the idea of Brahman world, like almost identical, because Brahman is described kind of like the Logos too. He's ineffable, but the effable name of him is Brahman, and then all other gods are manifestations of him, and all other creatures are manifestations of him, and the universe is a manifestation of him. So Brahmanism and Taoism and Stoicism are very, very, very similar. And Stoicism is going to be the first one that works its way into Judeo-Christianity. Pythagoras does because of the numerological similarities between stuff the Bible says and Pythagoras says, and then Neoplatonism is going to be the one that ultimately takes over Roman Catholicism and makes it the effed up piece of crap that it is. Okay? Don't listen to these people who are like, oh, it's the one true church. No, it's not. It is a cult that synthesized first Stoicism, then Neoplatonism. It's exactly what it did. Purgatory is just reincarnation in a form that doesn't say reincarnation. You get judged and you go to this place where you suffer because of the sins of your past life, and then if you suffer well, you come to the next life, which is their version of heaven. Okay, they just needed a version of reincarnation that worked with a historical paradigm with a start and a finish, and they do the exact same thing. The idea is if you want to escape samsara, well, you have to donate money to the Brahmins or the Buddhists and do all that stuff. Catholics are like, if you want to escape purgatory, you have to donate money to us. It's just power and money, and it's a cult. It's a cult. The Roman Catholic Church is an unchristian cult. Okay? I don't care if there's some deceived people in it who might be genuinely born again. There's some deceived people in Mormonism who might be genuinely born again too, but Mormonism is a cult, and Roman Catholicism is every bit as much a cult. It's just more old school. It's just based on philosophies that they've hidden the fact that originally have demonic origins. And then they have all these nuances in language, how everything, even though they do everything they do and say everything they say, it all has a slightly different meaning that is actually biblical. Bullshit. It's a cult. They have the same monasticism, the same rejection of marriage, the same worship of the mother goddess, the same exact thing. It is Mystery Babylon. It's one of her whores, okay? It's not the whore. It's not the whore of Babylon. The whore of Babylon is the manifestation of all of them going back to Shinar, which is where they originated. The original OG whore is in Henduada, the daughter of Sargon, who makes the first pantheon on a political basis. Before that, they had cult gods that were in more or less degrees based on the actual patriarchal lineages of Sumer and Egypt. That's what they had. After that, the pantheon starts to become a thing of mythological legends where they keep recreating it for political expediency. And then after that, because there's so much confusion, they draw these mysteries and philosophies out of it, which become all the Antichrist religions. And the one that absorbs them all into Christianity and says, yes, they're compatible and even divinely inspired, said the Ante-Nicene Fathers, was, Plato and the Stoics and Pythagoras, which are all derivative and mixed of each other, which are all originated in the Egyptian mysteries and the Babylonian mysteries, which are all mixed with Brahmanism and Buddhism and all that other crap, because they were all floating around at the same time. We even have, like, Clement of Alexandria mentioning Brahmins and Buddhists in his writings. They are Gnostics. The Catholic system is a Gnostic system. The Orthodox system is a Gnostic system, and if you just read Clement of Alexandria, he admits that it is. He just thinks it's the right Gnostic system. So, Tao Te Ching, Lao Tzu, is ultimately going to admit what it is. Okay? If you read the really old writings, they admit what they are. Socrates is like every good person is demonized because he thinks the demons are not the ghosts of the Nephilim, but the ghosts of our ancestors from the Golden Age, which is the pre-flood era. Okay? Now listen. Endlessly creating, endlessly pulsating, the spirit of the valley never dies. She is the hidden creator. Although she becomes the whole universe, her immaculate purity is never lost. Although she assumes countless forms, her true identity remains intact. Listen to her voice. Hear it echo through the creation. Without fail, she reveals her presence. Without fail, she brings us to her own perfection. That's what the Tao Te Ching says. Now compare that to what the Bible says. This is their form throughout the earth, the woman that sits in the midst of the ephah. And he said, this is wickedness. Remember, this is China, and China is based in Shinar. And behold, there came out two women, and the wind was in their wings, and they had wings like the wings of a stork, and they lifted up the ephah between earth and heaven. Then I said to the angel that talked to me, where do they carry the ephah? And he said to me, to build it a house in the land of Shinar, and when it is built, it will be set there on its foundations. Now, this would have been written by Zechariah around the time that the I Ching was being written. Zechariah is, let's see, sixth century BCE. And the earliest possible dating for so he would have been late 6th century. So the temple is being rebuilt by 618, I believe. And so that's when Zechariah is writing. That is the latest possible date for Lao Tzu and Confucius, or the earliest possible date for Lao Tzu and Confucius. So we see Lao Tzu 571. So roughly 50 years after Zechariah is when the earliest claim of Lao Tzu's existence is. So the Bible totally saw this coming, and listen what it says about Mystery Babylon. Remember, this is where it's heading. Why? Because the land of Shinar is always described as Babylon, always, but Shinar moves to China. Well, is it coming back? Yes, it is coming back, because the kings of the East and the Antichrist ultimately are going to go to war once the river Euphrates dries up. So where is China coming back to? Shinar. And who is going to be in tow? All the different nationalistic religious systems with them in the kings of the East who are against the Antichrist. And what happens? What's the first thing that happens? Mystery Babylon is destroyed. And this is war. It's Antichrist versus the kings of the East, or Antichrist, and his system's all going to be about merging into me. He's going to say, I am the way. He's going to say, I am the way. I am the Logos. Merge with me. Submit to my will in our common defense against the aliens who took over the Christians and raptured them away. Okay? Now listen to what she says. Remember how this says she's eternal, she's perfect, she's immaculate and pure. Okay? This is what Isaiah prophesies to Mystery Babylon. You said, I am the eternal queen, so you did not lay these things to heart or consider their end, saying to yourself, I am, and there is no other beside me. This is the Tao. I will never be a widow, I should say nor suffer the loss of children. I will never be a widow, nor suffer the loss of children. And then this is the Lord responding. Both of these will overtake you in a moment, on a single day. Loss of children and widowhood. Why? Who's her husband? The Antichrist. Who are her children? Remember, they're saying everybody's destiny is to be merged back into the one, which is where they came from, their great mother, mother of harlots. Okay? And so all the people who merge with her are going to be stuck with the Antichrist in the Great Tribulation, and they're going to die. They're going to die. And so he says, on a single day, loss of children and widowhood. You're going to lose your children. You're going to lose your husband. They will come upon you in full measure despite your sorceries and the great abundance of your enchantments. Let your astrologers come forward. Remember, this is all based in astrology. And those stargazers who make prediction month by month, let them stand up now and save you, who monthly predict your fate. Who's he referring to? He's talking about the Chinese prognosticators that originated in Babylon, who are using the I Ching to predict her fate. You think God is unaware of what's going on in China as these scriptures are being written? This is in the 8th century. This is in the 6th century. This is long before. Listen, when this is happening, the Zhou are composing the I Ching. When this is happening, within 50 years, Lao Tzu is going to compose the Tao Te Ching. God knows what they're doing. You're not clever. I see what you're doing. I'm going to let you do it all the way till the end of time, and then I'm going to destroy you all at once. In what? In one day. In one day. What's going to happen? Where are all of these children who are united to her through the mark of the beast going to be? They're going to be in Mystery Babylon. It's a city, but it's a system, and it expands globally, okay? So I suspect the actual physical headquarters of this is going to be Neom in Arabia. That's what I expect. But ultimately, it is spiritually tied to Shinar and Babylon. So it might have some kind of headquarters that's right in Babylon, or near Babylon, or in that area, the Tigris and Euphrates, where you might have some great internet hub or something like that the whole world's commerce and everything is routed through. That is still a possibility, but it seems like it's going to be Neom. So that's it. The Chinese system of yin and yang is there to put you to sleep, to accept these overturnings, these apostatizing as like, oh, this is just the wave. Oh, it's the Sith, then the Jedi, then the Sith, then the Jedi. It just keeps happening. It keeps happening. And this is why Star Wars is such a crap heap. What happened? Oh, the whole thing was about defeating Darth Vader and then the Emperor. And we finally defeated the Sith. Well, what happened? They came right back. Where did they come from? The Jedi. Where did the original Sith come from? The Jedi. Wait a minute. The Sith came from the Jedi? Yeah. The Sith Order, the Sith Empire, comes from the Jedi. When these Jedi leave the Jedi and find these force-sensitive beings called the Sith, and take over their civilization through combat, and then they lead them to form an empire called the Sith Empire. It was just some people that rebelled against the previous empire that was based on controlling the Force. And it just goes back and forth, and then you have the Eternal Empire, and then you have these other... And then by the time you get down to this Star Wars narrative, the Jedi have been ruling for thousands of years in terms of policing for the Republic. So they're an order that essentially the light side is ruling, and the Republic is the government, and the Jedi are basically its police force. And the Jedi basically get corrupt, get arrogant, and when the Sith come back from the Jedi, now Palpatine and existed all the way back from the Rule of Two, going to Bane, and it goes all the way forward to Palpatine, and then he finally kills Darth Plagueis, and then he takes over the whole thing, and he had Darth Maul as an apprentice, but then he discards Darth Maul, then he has Dooku, and then he discards Dooku, then he has Vader, and he's gonna discard Vader for Luke, but Luke refuses to turn to him, and so then he has Vader kill him, and Luke has been poking at Vader's sense of compassion and remorse and all this stuff, and Vader eventually sacrifices himself to kill the Emperor. And that's how he brings balance to the Force. Okay, well, what's bringing balance to the Force? It's not destroying the Sith. It's not destroying the Sith, because these are just the ebbs and flows of things that keeps happening. So what happens? Oh, Luke starts a new Jedi Order, and what happens there? Not long after, the Sith come back. Oh, and Palpatine never dies. Why? Oh, now we've totally gotten rid of the Sith, right? No, we never get rid of the Sith. It keeps coming back because they're going to keep doing this with Star Wars, and this universe keeps expanding to have these people that are outside of the universe that are so freaking scary, because this is all in Star Wars lore that keeps continuing. These so scary that the Jedi and the Sith have to get together to defend the galaxy against them. Because this only deals with one galaxy. What's outside of that galaxy? That's why when you look at these space-based mythologies, they always limit it to one galaxy, because a galaxy is so huge. But in the universe, there's tons and tons and tons of galaxies. This is why we don't get into multiverse theory. Why would you need to get into multiverse theories? We can't even fathom the next planet, let alone the next galaxy. It's so big. But they have these people from others, and they just devour the Force. The Force doesn't even see them coming. This is how crazy this gets. These other people, the Force doesn't even see them coming. They're impervious to it. So what is the Force in this system? It's a false god. And there are these other people that the Sith and the Jedi have to come together to fight against, who even the Force can't stop. Well, who does that sound like in the big picture? If the daughters of Shinar and the Force is the way, and the god of forces is basically Mystery Babylon, the mother of harlots, well, then who is this outside alien race that's even so powerful that they all need to unite together to fight it, that even the Force didn't see coming? And the answer is Christ and the Church. And the ultimate evil of the Star Wars universe is not the Sith. It's these other beings that are coming that the Sith and the Jedi need to unite together to save the galaxy. So Star Wars is literally drawing its listeners towards this pathway towards anti-Christianity and the idea of good and evil coming together to fight them, and what ultimately happens at the Battle of Armageddon. The people, the kings of the East, who represent the Sith, and the Antichrist kingdom, who represents the Jedi, they all come together to fight against Christ and his church as they come. Oh, crap. There's a worse thing. And we see the same thing in Tolkien. You see the elves and the dwarves, and they're all getting ready to fight each other. But all of a sudden, here come the goblins, and we all have to unite together to fight them. This is the picture that Satan keeps using myth and occult and story and narrative and movie and video game and all this stuff to project onto us. The world is always fighting, but that's okay. There's not good or evil. The real thing is when it needs to come together to defend against this exterior thing that is a threat to us all. Why? Because when you're not based in Christ, you can't move in love. And so the only thing that can cause you to unite is a common enemy. That's it. See, Christian unity is based on the triunity of the Godhead, who are forever eternally united in love, never separated. And the church is becoming conformed to the image and likeness of God in being united as one, not as a hive mind, as free-willed creatures who show deference and submit to one another in love like the Godhead does. This is why there's submission in the Trinity. Okay? And so is there eternal functional subordination? I'm not going to argue that. There is submission in the Trinity. That's all we need to know. There's demonstrated submission in the Trinity. That's all we need to know. Okay? And he wants us submitting to one another in love. Why? Because the church is the image and likeness of God. We're conforming to God. And ultimately, we're married to Christ and we're united bodily to Christ to become like God. We're the image and likeness of God. And as much as Christ is God, we become that ultimately in the resurrection. Not now, in the resurrection. These people who are infiltrating the church through Bethel and all that are taking you back to this is always what you were. You were always the children of God. You were always, because you were created by him. No, there's a difference between a creation and a child. There's a difference between being begotten and made. We are making a false God. We're not begetting it. Nobody's giving birth to AI. We're creating it. We know the difference, okay? Well, God knows the difference too. We to God, we're basically AI. Okay? And now he's breathed the spirit of life into us, so that makes us distinct. But until he reconforms us to something different, which is Christ, we're just a creature. We're a very advanced automaton with limited free will, but we're bound because we're a creature. And we're not unbound until we're fully realized in the resurrection. Now we're like Christ. Now what? No sin, no temptation, impervious, phase through walls. We can go back and forth between heaven and earth, between the purely spiritual realm and the material realm. Why? Because we're like Christ in the resurrection. We can do the things that he can do. And they want to say that, yeah, you can do this on the basis of gnosis, on the basis of imbibing forbidden knowledge and manipulating what God created to reverse engineer that to have God's power. That's what they're telling you to do. It's never going to work because the power that is beyond the universe, this is the power of the Creator that sustains and upholds the universe, isn't something that they can bottle up and sell. Nor is it something that they can steal. It's only something that they can mimic on a smaller scale. And what they're going to do is they're going to mimic it on a smaller scale in the image of the beast and the mark of the beast and say, look, we can do what God can do. And it's going to be a pitiful reflection of what God could do. Like, you think because you created trolls and goblins, that's the same as the guy who created elves and ents? This is stupid. This is a cheap knockoff. And yet they're going to try. And they're going to try to get you all to conform to it. And it's just a pathetic little lie. We can just look down at it and be like, that's just a pathetic little lie. This is just Satan scribbling around in the dirt trying to pretend he's a creator. And he can't create crap. He can't do anything. All he can do is corrupt and counterfeit. And that's all he's ever done. And all these systems like the Way and Buddhism and the Greek philosophies are just counterfeit New Testaments based on paganism. That's it. They're all counterfeit New Testaments to the same pantheons and polytheistic religions that were all based in Babylon. That's all it was. So I'm not going to get into all these different ones. I mean, definitely the book's going to cover these. It's going to cover the evolution of these things down to Mohism, and then because ultimately what happens in China is not going to come into the world stage really until the modern era, and then it's going to be like, look, we're older than you are, and they are older than because they're the original Shinar. Okay, so they actually have these versions of an evolution of the Babylonian system, which is really the system of the Canaanites, that stays relatively isolated from the rest of the world's philosophies and yet produces the same message at the end. Why? Because it's the OG. Okay? And so I call this the age of Antichrist, but ultimately who God ordains to take over the world as basically the cultural and linguistic tilling of the soil, if you will, into which the seed, which is the gospel, goes. He sends Alexander the Great to say, hey, go take over everything. And he basically takes over everything to the borders of China and into India and all the way out to the west. And there's also Greek colonies that he is involved with that go all the way out to Spain and England and Italy and stuff like that. Okay, so he takes over the known world, and the Greek version of this prevails as the primary backdrop into which Christianity comes. Christianity does go to the east, and it is received by some. A significant one would be the Kerala region of India. It also goes to China through the Nestorians. But in a lot of cases, they're going to perceive Christ as just another Buddha because they've had so many versions of this for so long that by the time Christianity gets there, you don't really have a messianic figure in the Greeks. Whereas in the East, you have all kinds of messianic figures, past, present, and future. And they just see Christ as another Buddha. Okay? So that's why it doesn't take hold as much into China until we get into the modern era. In India, it's still been spreading and expanding, but it's mostly been contained to the Kerala region until the modern era. It's just what happens. So that's where my book is. I'm on chapter 9, which is the age of Greek hegemony, which is going to take you down towards the Roman era and Christ. And then I'm going to speed run you from that into the modern era, and the epilogue is the Great Synthesis. It's the coming together of all these things, which is going to be at Mystery Babylon. So I just kind of summarized that for you, but this is where the book is going. I probably got about 300 pages written, and then I've got to, just keep refining it. But it's going to be a solid book when it's done. Serpent, by the way. I hope you guys are blessed by this update. And again, I will try to work through those Christ completing all the covenant promises and stuff like that, either tomorrow or maybe like Monday. We'll see. So you guys be blessed. Have a great rest of your week, man. Batman out. Peace.
Peace, I'm out. I'm Batman.